Hey, greetings everybody, it's Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, I think we've hit the end of the good times for Sylvanas, and her family have just gone off because there's a lot of talk of the Horde, the Alliance needs some help, and her parents went off to go talk with the Alliance. So stay a while and listen, we'll find out what happens next in Chapter 9 of the novel, Sylvanas. Sylvanas, indeed. Sylvanas, indeed all the Windrunner siblings, had made do without their mother before, and on rare occasions without their father, but the elder Windrunners had not left the confines of their kingdom for such an extended absence in their living memory. It was different for Lirath, who had already gotten used to living away from home, but Verath seemed uncomfortable. She was more content when the family was all together and safe. Sylvanas felt free. She hadn't realized the extent to which she had inured herself to her mother's discipline. She still pushed herself hard and woke at the same early hour, but there was an ease about her days now that she had never experienced before. And there was another feeling she had not experienced before, one she had never had time or patience to pursue, or frankly interest. But Nathanos Maris, the oft-scowling, sharp-witted, irreverent human, interested her greatly. She did not shirk her duties, but she also allowed herself to indulge in something she hadn't for a long, long time. Sylvanas let herself play. Nathanos was almost as often the object of her amusement as he was her interest, but his tongue was as sharp as hers, and he had no hesitation in firing off a scathing retort. It was delightful and heady and heart-pounding, and Sylvanas loved it. At one point, she had taken him on one of her favorite paths to see the sanctum of the sun, admire its turning orbs that represented the stars, and explore the less traveled path behind it that led up to Sun Gray's peak. The first part was easy, but the last required more than a little climbing. "So," Nathanos said as he plopped down beneath an ancient tree, "what's my reward?" He took a swig from the water skin and stretched out arms beneath his head. Sylvanas gestured at the breathtaking panorama unfolding below them. "This," she said. From here they could see the sanctum of the sun to the south, and just glimpse Tranquillion in the northwest. But there was also a beautiful view of the sunset in Windrunner's spire and the calm stillness of a lake. "I like being up here alone, with nobody needing or wanting anything from me. You're the first person I've taken here." That seemed to take Nathanos by surprise, and he had no sly quip for her. Sylvanas sat beside him, hands clasped around her knees. The silence stretched out as a soft breeze tousled their hair, bearing the scent of flowers. "Why me?" Nathanos asked quietly. One second, guys. All right, back in business. Why me? Nathanos asked quietly. It was an honest question with no pretense or wryness about it. "You could have your pick of anyone and they would be guaranteed to be better company than me." Sylvanas couldn't help but smile as she returned her gaze to the glorious sanctum and sighed. "Look at what surrounds us here in Silvermoon, everywhere. Everything you see is beautiful. All our statues are polished, all our music is elegant, all our weapons are bright and gleaming and lovely. Everyone has eyes you can get lost in, regal noses, flawless skin. It's all so very pretty." Sylvanas loved her people, but a thread of arrogant superiority was inextricably woven into the fabric of the Quel'Drai tapestry. She took great delight in deflating swelled egos in her equals and superiors, and she had never liked bullies. But taking them down a peg was one thing. If need be, she would still give her life to protect any one of them. Sylvanas turned back to Nathanos, whose dark gaze was fixed on her face. "But the world isn't perfect, Nathanos, and the only people who know that, who truly understand that, are the ones who have to go out and deal with that world. It's not pretty when a troll is snarling a handspan from your face, or you've only wounded a springpaw and it's about to rip your belly to bloody shreds. I think this is what sets the Farstriders apart more than anything else. because our eyes are truly open. Everyone else lives in their soft and safe version of the world. Those we protect them not just from the danger, we protect them from the true face of this world. She sighed and turned to lay down, propping herself up on one elbow. To me, beauty is commonplace, perfection is dull, and... Sylvanas brushed his mop of scruffy brown hair from his brow and laughed softly. Nathanos Maris, you are the ugliest and least dull person I have ever met. And that, she said, her voice falling to a whisper as she leaned down and brought her face closer to his, is why I like you. Nathanos reached up, his calloused fingers pleasantly rough on the smooth curve of her cheek. There was a startling gentleness in the gesture and a sense of wonder in his eyes as he touched her that made Sylvanas' heart beat faster. My lady, he said in a rough whisper, you are too smart to be so foolish. She could not help but smile slightly as she recalled her words from the first day they met. Be silent, or I will silence you myself. His eyes lit up. He remembered that moment too. In a voice laced with humor, replied, and how would you manage it? And then he spoke nothing more. As Sylvanas pressed her lips to his, one of his large, powerful hands cupping the back of her head, as the other slipped around her waist. He held her tightly, and Sylvanas had the feeling he would never, ever let her go. When a summons came from the court, Sylvanas and Lireesa were at the retreat, busily preparing a bear pelt. The courier blanched at the carnage spread out on the grass, then said, Lady Lireesa, Lady Sylvanas, you are ordered to report to His Majesty the King at once. The two sisters looked at each other. Something you did? Lireesa asked, not as an accusation, but as a simple question. Sylvanas wasn't angry. It was a reasonable assumption. Oddly enough, no, she said. She frowned. She was called to court now and then, but that was because she was the future Ranger General. Extending the invitation to Lireesa as well could only mean one thing. Danger. Turning back to the courier, she asked, Is this a Far Strider matter? I regret that I have not been informed about the reason for the summons, only that I am to bring the two of you as quickly as possible. Perhaps her parents had sent word of a pending attack. Maybe the orcs were at last turning their sights on Quel'Thalas, and the time had come for war. Even as the thought crossed her mind, Sylvanas was running to the waiting Dragonhawks, Lireesa hard on her heels. Sylvanas had been prepared to enter a war council in progress, so she and her sister were confused when they were led to a smaller, more intimate antechamber and told the king would be with them shortly. Not good. Neither of them sat in the offered chairs. Lireesa leaned against the wall, fidgeting with the sheathed blade at her hip, as if she wished she could draw it and attack whatever emergency was about to be sprung on them. For her part, Sylvanas paced like a caged animal, her mind racing with the need to know, and her skin fairly crawling with the need to act. The door opened, and His Majesty King Anasterian Sunstrider entered the room. But neither of the Windrunner sisters focused attention on their liege, instead turning to the one who was with them, Verath. And that awful heartbeat they all knew. This was not a Far Strider matter. It was a family one. No, it can't be that. It's something else. Anasterian's face was etched with reserved but genuine sorrow, and he waved them all to sit. Sylvanas obeyed, feeling strangely stiff, as if her body were an unfamiliar thing she had forgotten how to move. She did not want to sit and listen, because she knew what her king was going to say, and the second the words were uttered, it would be real, and everything would fall apart. I have received a report, the king said. Know that my own heart is heavy with grief, but I must inform you that your parents, and all who accompanied them, are dead. Sylvanas' heart lurched, and for a terrible moment she felt faint. Both? The single word contained such a world of pain, shock, and horror that the crack in Lireeth's voice left a gaping feeling in Sylvanas' chest. Tragically, yes. It is a great loss, not only to you, the children they were so proud of, but to everyone in this kingdom. They were much admired, and in many cases beloved by all who knew them. Both. Mother and father gone, just like that. It can't be. There must have been some mistake. Their parents were not old, not like the king. Elves lived long lives. The children should have had decades, probably centuries together. Earlier she had been taut and anxious, but now Sylvanas felt frozen. Lireesa and Verath were so pale as to be almost bloodless. An Astarion was speaking, but Sylvanas couldn't comprehend his words. They reached her, but in a slightly distorted way, so they were almost nonsensical. Focus, Sylvanas, she told herself. You have to be strong right now. She took a long, shaky breath and forced herself to concentrate on Astarion's words. They were ambushed while making camp for the evening, but presently we are not yet certain by whom. Sylvanas blinked. Surely she had misheard. Ambushed? No, she said flatly. An accident, perhaps, a sudden storm, a fire. Nature itself, perhaps, could defeat even their indomitable mother, but not a living enemy. Lireesa was many things, but she would never let her guard down, not for an instant, particularly if their father's life. This information is wrong. My mother would never allow her party to be taken by surprise. This is Lireesa Windrunner. And abruptly she remembered how much she had hated listening to all the stories about Lireesa's nigh godlike achievements. Now Sylvanas would give anything to watch Lireesa sitting and laughing with friends, trying to dismiss the talk of her heroism while her husband smiled and held her hand. An Astarion looked at her sympathetically. I share your disbelief. Never would I have thought. He shook his head. Inconceivable as it seems, all evidence, little though there was, points to this being the truth. Sylvanas belatedly realized that with her mother's death, she was Ranger General now. She needed to act like it. Your Majesty, speaking his title helped. It made him a king again in her eyes. A king grieving personally, yes, but one who had also lost his Ranger General and his chief advisor in a single dreadful incident. When you say little evidence, what do you mean precisely? How cold and detached she sounded. Unfortunately for our investigation, an Astarion replied, by the time the bodies were discovered, scavengers had already done their work. An Astarion was trying to be as delicate as possible, but Sylvanas was from a long line of hunters. She was well acquainted with what scavengers did to corpses. Then you cannot be certain it was them, Lireesa said, her voice strained, as disbelieving as her sister had been. Lireesa sat unspeaking, pale and still as a statue in the moment. An Astarion regarded her with kindness. Lady Lireesa, the bodies were discovered by the Windrunner household. Another hope snuffed out like a candle flame. Like the lives of her parents and the Farstriders who had died defending them, no one but the Windrunner children themselves would have been better to identify the lord and lady of the house than the servants who had spent their lives beside them. Everyone in the party has been accounted for. The assailants took anything of value, including secret information meant for the Alliance leaders. Then this is no simple robbery, Sylvanas said. She was composed now, latching onto discipline and training like a lifeline. Her siblings looked at her, then at each other. They, too, did what they could to calm themselves. She was deeply proud of them, especially Lireesa, who did not have the grim experience she and Lireesa had with death. No, it is not, an Astarion agreed. We suspect the work of our old friends, the Amani. No doubt they would relish access to any information about our military movements. Does Illyria know? I have sent a messenger, but the eldest Windrunner will be difficult to track down. The eldest Windrunner. Illyria was now, wasn't she? They're gone. Both gone. We must find out exactly what happened. Sylvanas' voice still sounded so strange and strained in her own ears. I will go to the site. Others are already there, an Astarion said, including Theron. But they aren't me, the thought screamed in her brain. I'm the Ranger General, and they were my parents and my Farstriders. No one would do as thorough an investigation as I. As if reading her agonized, angry thoughts, the king added, Lothamar has assured me that he will scour the area. He will be relentless and exhaustive in his investigation. Once that is done, their remains will be brought home with all the reverence they are due. He paused, then added kindly, I understand your desire for their deaths to have been due to something strange and unfamiliar, A great threat like the Dark Eagle, not at the hands of simple trolls, but when we have had enemies at our door for millennia, it is not difficult to know who to blame. And how let's handle this particularly cruel aspect of the tragedy now. Much of leadership is understanding when to delegate. Lireesa and Verath Windrunner will be brought home as soon as possible, with every care and respect given them. You know this. I will not shy away from my first duty as Ranger General, to discover who slew 2 vital court members and several Farstriders in such a cowardly fashion. My king, I ask you, please let me lead this investigation. We 3 are Windrunners, and we will not shirk our duties, not even the painful ones. Sylvanas learned most of her ranger skills from her mother, but she had learned much from Verath too, and one such lesson was that many times the royal court was a more dangerous place than the wilderness. Wild beasts were driven by simple things, hunger or dominance. Trolls by hatred pure and simple. The predators in the Sunstrider court were far worse. Greed, ego, fear, and pride drove them, and those were hungers that could never be sated. Sylvanas was well aware that she was not popular, and that if she showed any sign of weakness now, she would be as doomed and as an injured doe when the great cat struck. The one thing her mother had given her, albeit grudgingly, was to name Sylvanas as her heir. Sylvanas would not let anyone take that title, that honor, away from her, especially if they thought to use Lireesa's death as evidence of her daughter appearing unsuited to the role. And Asterion was silent for a time, and Sylvanas wondered if she had pushed too hard. Against my better judgment, he said at last, I will grant your request. The crown appreciates your devotion. But take care, Ranger General, that your desire for justice does not blind you to a truth you uncover. He rose, and the children of Lireesa and Verath rose as well. Once again, I am truly sorry for your loss, the king said. Ranger General, you will depart on the morrow. My liege, with your permission, I will depart within the hour. Sister, it can wait, Lireesa said. Even as Sylvanas looked up, meeting the gaze of their king. No, justice, punishment cannot wait, sister, Sylvanas retorted. A shadow of annoyance, quickly dispelled through centuries of practice, flickered across Asterian's patrician visage. As you wish. Make your farewells here, then, and meet me in the council chamber when you are ready. You will be given a full debriefing. Take your time, he added, and closed the door. Lireesa's face crumpled. Lirath, still in a state of semi-shock, blinked and looked from one to the other. His face abruptly seemed to register what was going on. Lady Moon, he said, his voice shaking. Don't leave. Not yet. Please. He had never begged for anything, but he was begging now. Sylvanas' heart broke a little bit more. You know I must, she said. She wanted to be kinder, to hug him, the baby of the family, far too young to be an orphan. All of them were too young, and that thought made her angry. She found strength she badly needed in the emotion. We know, Lireesa said. People will look to us as an example. They will be frightened and worried. We must comfort them by being strong. Even now, Lireesa was the one to speak of comforting others. Sylvanas loved her fiercely. I know, Lireesa said. I'm just not ready to be alone yet. You won't be, Lireesa hastened to assure him, giving him the embrace Sylvanas could not, would not. Sylvanas bitterly wished she did not have to say what she was about to. Lireesa, Sylvanas said, most of the other high-ranking Farstriders were with our parents. The rest are likely at the murder site investigating. I will need you to represent the family properly among their number, here in Silvermoon till I return. Lireesa's face fell, but she nodded. Verath bit his lip but did not protest. Lireesa then would not be with him. They were Windrunners. They understood. Write them a lament, Verath, Sylvanas said suddenly. Her brothers stared at her. I cannot. Yes, you can. It would mean so much to them, and to us, she added, to me. I will know that someone is turning such terrible pain into beauty, and that will give me strength. You are the only one who can do them justice. Sylvanas heard her voice crack on the last word, justice. She would make sure her parents had it. She needed to leave right now or else she would lose herself to grief. And so she nodded one more time at them standing in front of her, holding each other's hands as they had all done when they were younger and the world was kinder. Her first task was to attend a thorough debriefing. Her second was to find Nathanos Maris. It was harder to tell him than Sylvanas had expected. She gave him the briefest of summaries, calling her parents the Ranger General and the Chief Advisor instead of using Mother or Father or even their names. It was better that way. Keeping the emotions at arm's length would permit her to focus on finding the killers. Nathanos had instinctively moved to embrace her, but Sylvanas stepped back. Mother and the Farstriders could have handled trolls, she had told him. I want you to come with me because I suspect Horde activity. You are more familiar with them than any of us here, and you grew up in the area. You may notice something we would miss. Of course, he had replied. Good thinking. Let's go. The site was located in the East Weald, a few miles south of the Alliance's Northwatch Tower. They flew in silence, each on a separate dragonhawk. Sylvanas' mind was whirling with 1,000 thoughts, half of them helpful, half of them threatening to break her entirely. She spotted the corpses before anything else. 8 of them there were, covered with cloth. Sylvanas could not blame the devastated household. Their first instinct would be to show respect, but the loving gesture had been a mistake. Difficult as it would be to see the mutilated bodies of family and friends, Sylvanas knew that some clues, possibly vital ones, would have already been destroyed. She tore her gaze away from the shapes on the earth and felt the tightness in her chest ease as she spotted Lorthamar and Haldoran below, with a few other familiar, trusted Farstriders, as well as some of the hunters from Qualithian Lodge, including their leader, Ranger Lord Renthar Hawkspear. Someone in the royal livery whom she did not recognize was there too. Sylvanas frowned. On one hand, it was natural that Anastarian would want to have someone who could report to him directly, to be his eyes here. On the other, that was what the Farstriders were supposed to do. She recalled how anxious the king had been for her to not examine the site herself. Sylvanas had no doubt that some of it, perhaps most of it, was genuine compassion, but some of it wasn't, and the slim figure standing to the side wearing the king's livery was the proof. As her dragonhawk began to descend, the familiar but no less horrible scent of decomposition rose to meet them. She landed, slipped off her dragonhawk, and strode to her friends, nodding at Haldoran and turning to Lorthamar. She did not even acknowledge the king's representative. He was there to observe, not to help, so let him observe. Report, she asked. Assume I have been told nothing. What are your thoughts? Lorthamar glanced at Nathanos. Sylvanas did not have time to waste on long explanations, so she said bluntly, The Eastweald is his home, and if this is Horde activity, he would know that better than us. Lorthamar nodded, then adopting her cool demeanor, filled her in. 2 days ago, one of the white horses ridden by Lireesa and Verath had shown up at the spire. It was unharmed but agitated, and the household feared the worst, and they had been correct. Because scavengers had fed on the corpses, it was not easy to ascertain time of death, but the Farstriders were used to even the subtlest clues of decay and placed the time at no more than a week, probably only 3 or 4 days. Lorthamar led them around the site. Small markers had been placed near anything that might be useful to examine so that no one would accidentally tread on them. It had been quite a bit too late for that, Sylvanas thought. Much of what could have been useful had already been trod upon, and the recent rain had done nothing to help. There weren't many prints, Lorthamar said quietly, but everything we saw does seem to point to the trolls. He pointed to the northeast. Zulmashar might have recognized a good opportunity to strike. The moss flare numbers are not what they once were, Sylvanas said. Such an audacious attack is more likely to have come from the Amani. But why would they travel so far from Quel'Thalas? Perhaps the prize was worth the journey, came a voice. Renthar Hawkspear approached and bowed. Taller than most and with a more muscled physique, he cut a commanding figure, his black hair up in a topknot and his face strong and sharp. Ranger General, he said, I wish you were here on other business. So do we all, Sylvanas replied. And yes, but the prize practically walked right past them as the group headed toward the gate. It would be a terrible strategy to follow an attack so far away, and whatever they may be, the Amani do understand strategy. Sylvanas shook her head. No, Renthar, something is not adding up. She walked over to where one of the corpses lay. Sylvanas, Haldoran said quickly, but the warning came too late. Sylvanas had already removed the cloth. Terrible though the thought was, she had hoped she would reveal the still face of a forest rider. Instead, Sylvanas found herself staring at the arrow-riddled body of their leader. Lireesa Windrunner's face was pale, her body stiff. Sylvanas felt as if she had been struck, but then felt an emotion other than grief welling up inside her. Pride. Her mother had died doing what she had vowed to do, defending others, trying to keep her people, her family, safe. She died the hero she had been in life, even if this time her sacrifice seemed to be in vain. I won't let it be, Sylvanas thought. You'd want me to find who did this. I will, I promise. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to focus. So many arrows. She tugged one free and saw the poison on the tip. Definitely troll. Could Anastarian be right? Had her mother simply been taken unawares? Her gaze roved over the body, silently asking her mother to reveal any clues that would help Sylvanas avenge her. She paused. There were 2 other holes in the leather armor made by an arrow that had not been merely removed but tugged out. Nathanos had stepped up beside her, silent but present and steady. She straightened. The Ranger General would never simply pull out an arrow, certainly not in the heat of battle. Someone wanted their arrows back. Is that not the way of archers? The courtier put in. Do you not recover them, so as not to waste ammunition? Most times we do, Sylvanas said, but then why were not all the arrows removed? Why leave some but not others? Because, Lorthamar said, stepping beside her, they only wanted us to notice some, but not others. Haldron had come over too now, and the trio looked at one another. They and Nathanos all knew what was going on, but their shared instincts would not convince the king. They had to find proof. Sylvanas knelt again beside her mother's body. Thank you, mother, she whispered. I will find them. I will protect our people from them. May you rest with ease. Your duty is done. Her gaze fell on the quiver caught under Lireesa's body as she fell. 3 arrows yet remained. Sylvanas bit her lip, then reached out and pulled her mother's arrows from the slightly flattened quiver. She looked at them for a moment, at the colors of the Windrunners and the Forest Riders, the distinctive brown and gold. Then she stood slipping the arrows into her own quiver, accepting her legacy. She was not formally Ranger General, not yet, but even so, all the Forest Riders who had witnessed her action inclined their heads with respect. Nathanos looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, and said, I have a hunch. Will you accompany me? Yes, she said at once. I will come too, Minthar said, and Lorthamar and Haldoran nodded as well. No, Sylvanas said, stay here. Keep looking for clues. Look for cuts not made by weapons we know, or by weapons much larger than usual. We will return shortly. All 3 of them looked disapprovingly at Nathanos, even Lorthamar, whose life he had saved. Shall I close the investigation? Lorthamar asked. Not yet. Your parents and those who died fighting alongside them deserve proper treatment. My parents and those who died fighting alongside them deserve justice, Sylvanas said, more harshly than she had intended. We will not be long. They shared a single dragon hawk, so their words would not be lost in the wind. Sylvanas clutched the saddle, unwilling to touch Nathanos for fear she might break down. Where are we going? In my happier time, my family's farmstead. It's south of here. I see. And what would we do there? She said, a ghost of her old impish self peeking out, desperately seeking lightness in the darkness of the day's revelations. Why, I would introduce you to my little cousin Stefan, Nathanos said in a deadpan voice. She smiled a little. He always knew what she needed. But today we're scouting. I respect the Forest Riders, but I do not think they look past the immediate area for clues. Silence stretched on between them. It was the horde, wasn't it? It was a statement, not a question. I think so, yes. No one removes only a few arrows. They remove the ones that would betray them. Orcish arrows. They left the troll ones to trick us into thinking the trolls acted alone. Her voice was clipped, cold. They would pay. They cleaned their tracks as well, and the rain was their friend, Nathanos said, hoping they grew careless farther south. They flew on in silence. Sylvanas kept her eyes on the ground as Nathanos kept the dragonhawk close to the ground, so low its wings almost touched the earth on the downbeat. There, she said, on your left. Nathanos turned the beast's head and veered it to the west. I see them, he said, but the outline of the footprint is not clear. Could easily be a troll's print that widened with the rain. We know what happened, Sylvanas said. Halderon, Renthar, Lorthamar, we all know. Any forest rider, or indeed anyone with any experience with arrows at all, knew better than to remove one on the battlefield. The resulting blood loss would be more dangerous than the arrow itself. If possible, the arrow would be cut in half and removed in 2 pieces to avoid pulling the barbs through the flesh. Yes, Nathanos said grimly. All arrows are fletched differently, and they're slightly larger. They are not fools, these orcs, Sylvanas muttered. They collaborated with the trolls, as was feared. The orcs waited until the group was far enough from any defense, then attacked, while the trolls closed in behind. The king was right about that. It was an ambush. Nathanos was silent. Then he said in a soft voice that few other than Sylvanas had ever heard, You would not have saved them. She closed her eyes in pain. We will never know. I could have tried. I'm glad you did not. They continued to fly over the area until any tracks that might have been of use merged with those ordinary citizens who trod the roads. Nothing. Not a corpse or overly large wagon marks or even a footprint. We should return, she said at last. We have nothing to prove their murderers were anyone other than the old enemy. I'm sorry. I know you did not fail them. Sometimes the enemies win. Today was one such day. But we will not hear the end of it, not for a long time, and we can change the ultimate outcome of what's to come. We will, she said, and then was silent. When they returned, Sylvanas spoke with Lorthamar, Renthar, and Halderon. I believe this was done by the Horde, she said. I have fought trolls and have seen what is left after a battle, and there are things here that are simply wrong, but without any hard evidence to take to our king. She paused and swallowed hard. I have no choice but to say, the investigation is closed. Lorthamar and Halderon looked at her with sympathy. Renthar scowled. That does not sit well with me, nor you, I see. No, and if anything else is discovered, I trust Qualithian Lodge will report to me at once. With all speed possible, he assured her. I must agree with you. Then Lorthamar hesitated. How should we address you now? Ranger General? Ranger Lord? The question heard as if she herself had been impaled by a Horde arrow. I am neither. For now, you may call me Sylvanas. She squared her shoulders. I must pay my respects to the fallen. Please arrange for the bodies to be brought home with all due care as they deserve. It shall be done, Halderon said. She walked through the site once more, pausing at every covered form on the ground. The Forest Riders had all been much older, some with literal centuries of experience. How many Horde had it taken to bring them down, Sylvanas wondered. How many corpses of their own had the monsters had to move? Now that she knew to look for it, she could see where nearly every one of them had an arrow removed. There were 2 Forest Riders with deep cuts from weapons far heavier than any troll would wield. Sylvanas knew it would not be enough to change anything. Finally, she paused in front of the last body, that of her father. Father. This should not have been his fate. He should have lived to see generations of descendants, and been able to spend his time in later life with a good look at a book and a glass of wine. She was not yet ready to let him go. She hesitated. If she saw the body, it would make everything real. She would have lost not only her fiery, exacting, heroic mother, but her gentle, wise, humorous father, who was in his own way as strong as his wife. Before she knew it, she had dropped to her knees beside him. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She tried and failed to control the shaking of her hand as she pulled back the cloth and looked at the beloved face. His skin was now as white as his hair. She noted that she had shaved the stubble that had teased him about the last time she had seen him. Strange what odd and seemingly trivial details the mind clung to. You always loved me no matter what I did. Your punishments were reasoned and fair, and you taught me to think. Mother's duty to the crown always put her in danger. I never thought yours would. I will fight for both of you, she whispered, though the quell the lost you always loved. Her friends gave her space and time to grieve, and when she returned to them, she was resolute. I will take word to the king myself, she said, and I will stop by Windrunner Spire on my way to thank them. and offer what comfort I can." The household had been rocked to its core. Many of them had served the Windrunners all their lives. A few were even here carrying on an ancestral tradition, the honor of aiding one of the land's most famous families. She did what she could, Nathanos waiting outside for her. When at last she emerged, she said, "There is one more stop. You can come with me if you like." Nathanos had known, and if not welcomed, had always treated respectfully by those who tended the household's mounts. Sylvanas felt another pang, one of so very many today, when she caught sight of Arrow Flight. The mare whickered in recognition and butted her head against Sylvanas, who stroked her soft white mane. "My lady," exclaimed Talvis, and the head groomsman, "'tis a miracle!" What a strange, cruel thing to say in such a dark moment, Sylvanas thought, and then realized what he meant. "It is," she agreed. "At least we still have Arrow Flight. You've always taken such good care of." "Nay, my lady, her too, yes, but come see." She and Nathanos followed him out, and her heart jumped. Behind the stables was another white horse, Parley. Her joy was short-lived as she saw the blood that dripped down his right flank. Before she could say anything, Talvis reassured her. "He will be fine, my lady. There was no poison, and we removed the arrow with all care. We're now cleansing the wound, but it's a bit painful." Sylvanas fumbled in her pouch. "Here," she said, "wound one." Talvis knew exactly what to do. "Thank you. He'll be glad of it." Slowly, Sylvanas walked toward the horse. Nathanos followed Talvis, talking to him quietly. Parley's nostrils flared, and he lowered his head so she could pet his soft muzzle, his trembling slowly ceasing at the touch of a familiar hand. Both of them. Somehow both steeds had survived and found their way home, although their masters had not. It was indeed a miracle. She thought of the many days she had ridden Parley, her father's warmth at her back, the stallion careful of his burden, the sun on her face. "Sylvanas." She turned to see Nathanos standing there. She looked at his face, then at the object he held in his hand. The arrow was not of a troll's making. Sylvanas took a quick breath. There had been no poison. "Is it?" "Yes, it's a horde arrow." Sylvanas flung her arm around Parley's neck. She was not superstitious, but somehow she knew that wherever her parents were, they were at peace. "Thank you, Father. You've given me one final gift. I will keep my promise to you." It would take courage to challenge a king. An Astarion might punish her if he did not agree with her conclusion. He might even remove her from the Farstriders. Her cheek pressed against the warmth of the horse's neck. She could almost hear her father's voice one final time. "Believe in yourself, my dear girl, as I have always believed in you." Sylvanas was received warmly enough. Upon her arrival, she was escorted to a room she had never seen before, a side chamber that was much more intimate and cozier than any of the larger ones. Thick rugs covered the stone floor, and while there were portraits and statuary, the scale was much smaller. Instead of a vast table capable of seating up to 20, there was only a small one with 2 comfortable-looking chairs, a decanter of wine, and 2 glasses. A fire burned cheerily, and between its flames and the flicker of candles, it was altogether a welcoming place. If her heart had been so wounded and her mission so urgent, Sylvanas would have enjoyed it. As it was, when an Astarion waved her to a seat, she replied, "Thank you, your majesty. If it please you, I prefer to stand." "It would please me if you sat," he said. "Your task has been a painful one." Sylvanas knew an order when she heard one, no matter how pleasant the words or tone, so she obeyed. The king poured a glass of wine for himself. "Will you have a glass as well? If you prefer, I can have some tea or juice brought in." "Nothing for me, thank you," she said. "To business, then," the king said. "Tell me your report and your conclusion." Sylvanas did so. He maintained a pleasant, interested expression as she told him about the search for clues, the evidence that seemed to point to troll activity, and the evidence that didn't. "I was prepared to agree with your assertion, your majesty," she said, "until my father's horse returned with this in his side." She placed a white cloth on the table between them and unwrapped it. For a long moment the king stared at the arrow. Then he rose and stood by the fire, waving at her to stay seated, then turned his back to her as he gazed into the embers. "Your father always spoke well of you. Difficult as this situation must be, you have displayed resolve and dedication to your duty. Your parents died as they lived, serving the crown, protecting the kingdom and doing what was best for their people. He turned to her then. I believe you will do the same. I trust that is so, my liege. The king nodded and indicated the arrow. May I? At her nod, he carefully picked it up. The dried blood of her father's steed was still painted on it. Your investigation was thorough, and this does seem to confirm your suspicion that the Horde, not simply the trolls, was behind the slaughter. But it is of no use to us, not if we both want to do what is best for the people. Anastarion let the arrow fall from his hands into the fire. Without thinking, Sylvanas leaped from her seat and lunged toward the hearth, trying to retrieve at least something of the arrow that told the truth. Anastarion's hand grabbed her wrist. What are you doing? She cried. That was the only way we could prove what happened. He chose to ignore her outburst, speaking calmly. I have seen war, Sylvanas. So have your parents. It is a horrible thing. The troll attacks already cost us in lives. In the faith of our people, we will keep them safe. And in the faith of our people. This is not our war. It is now. It is only if we choose to make it so. She stared at him, disbelieving. Recklessly, she said, My father once told me you were wise to treasure those bold enough to speak truth to you. Did he lie? Displeasure flickered across his face. She knew she was pushing too hard, but she couldn't seem to stop. He did not lie. I do treasure you for what you have uncovered, but I must also speak truth to you. Stoking fears of invasion and mysterious monsters can only bring harm to this kingdom. We are safe, Sylvanas. They will never take our land. We have the Sunwell to protect us, and I have every faith in your Farstriders to defend us should the need arise. Your parents always did what was best for our people, even if they disagreed. Will you carry that legacy forward? Will you defy your king? It was so terribly unfair, and it was wrong. The worst part was she understood Anastarion's decision. The kingdom was indeed well protected. There were ways to gather information and prepare without risk. Her heart protested, but Sylvanas knew that her king knew much more of politics and war than she did. And besides, she knew that her parents would have seen this too and have obeyed their king, as she had to. At least will you allow me to double our patrols? Send us extra arms and supplies. We know the danger is out there. The Farstriders must be ready to meet it. I cannot see the need for such measures, Anastarion said. Your parents journeyed beyond the Sunwell's protection, and for their fate I am deeply sorry. But I must have your word, Ranger General. You must not speak of this to anyone. I cannot be looking over my shoulder, uncertain of your loyalty. She bowed her head. I understand your reasoning, my liege, and I will do as my parents have. I remain a loyal subject to my king. He relaxed. I value this more than you know. Comfort yourself with the knowledge that in this choice you are truly serving your people. Sylvanas bowed and left. She would keep the vow she just made, but she had chosen her words carefully. She would not speak of this openly. But that did not mean she could not pursue her own search for justice or prepare her troops for the coming storm. The next several days were a merciful blur. The ceremony to honor the fallen Ranger General and Ambassador and Counselor was all it should have been. Reverent, poignant, full of meaning. The bodies were encased in mort cloths woven in the Windrunner colors, their names carefully embroidered with gold thread. Flowers of every hue were placed on the bodies and the bier that supported them. Verath and Lireesa Windrunner would lie in state for a full day, so that those they had served so well in life could pay their respects. Sylvanas, Verath, and Lireesa stood beside the wrapped forms, clad in mourning cloths and wearing the family tabard. Illyria did not attend. Sylvanas had not spoken to Lireesa since that day when Anastarion had called the Windrunner children together to inform them of the devastating news. Her brother looked terrible, the dark clothing only serving to emphasize his pallor. He was so young, so poor at hiding his emotions, that it was clear every minute here was torture. After about an hour, he seemed to make some kind of decision, leaving his position and walking up to Sylvanas. His cheekbones, always high and elegant, appeared to jut through his skin. His eyes glittered from the hollows of their sockets. He even held himself differently, slightly hunched instead of tall and broad, as if he could curl in on himself far enough to disappear entirely. Sylvanas regarded him with what sympathy she could spare, ready to comfort, to make amends, but his words surprised her. "Train me." The same thing he had always seemed to ask her over the years. Except this time it wasn't a child's plea, or a youth's insecurity. It was a demand, spoken by someone suddenly forced to become an adult in the cruelest way possible. She took him gently by the arm and steered him away from the crowd of mourners still gathering. "We will talk about this later," she said. "No, we will talk about it now." She blinked. There was a hardness to him she'd never seen before. "I know you're in shock," she said, "but we've discussed this before." "Everything has changed now," he said harshly. "When I asked before, it was in a world of softness, of privilege, of wine and song and laughter and family. That world's gone now." One moment, all. And it's never coming back. You and Illyria and Verath, you at least get to strike at the monsters who took them from us. He was right about that, at least. But he was wrong, too, because even in her own grief, Sylvanas knew that the world of softness and music would not be gone forever. Things had changed, yes, but the Quell de Rai survived. Verath would adapt. They all would. Sylvanas wanted more for him than for her sisters, though. Lireesa and Verath's daughters had already known the world could be punishing and violent. The three stood between that darkness, that hard truth, and their people, so the people could recover and laugh and sing again. And Sylvanas was determined that Lireesa would never taste that bitter draught. "Everything feels so empty now. Frivolous. Mother and father are dead and I am wasting my life. That cannot be what they would have wanted." Sylvanas was worn thin and she almost snapped at him. Instead, she took a deep breath. "Lireesa," she said as kindly and quietly as she could manage, "do you know how hard it was on them that all their daughters followed Mother's path? A path of danger and violence, where we could die at any minute. Don't you think they sighed with relief knowing that at least one of their children might be safe? Don't you think Illyria and Verath and I do?" His face crumpled and he looked away, but his jaw was still clenched. "It's hard enough having to bury mother and father, to mourn them. Do you think I want to bury you? Mourn you? I don't. I won't, and that is why I refuse to teach you." There was a long pause, then Lireesa squared his shoulders and looked back at his sister. "Of all of us, I thought you would believe in me, but you don't." He started to say something else, paused, then gave a short nod, cold and curt. It was frightening, as if something in him had abruptly broken. "You don't," he said again, almost to himself. He turned without another word, making his way through the crowd, his back to her. Sylvanas wanted to run after him, but she couldn't. Let him be angry. Let him live to hate me for the rest of his long, full, safe life. Lireesa moved to her sister, looking after Lireesa. "Lireesa, go after him. He shouldn't be alone right now. You need to be there for him, as I cannot." "He needs you, not me. He doesn't want me. I'm sorry, little Lord's son, but I made you a promise you don't even remember. With love and courage, I will keep you safe." Lireesa searched her eyes, seeing how much it hurt her sister to send Lireesa when Sylvanas so clearly yearned to go. But the elder sister's position would not permit her. "Of course," Lireesa said quietly. She turned and followed their brother. Sylvanas locked her legs into position and endured through the growing heat of the day, the welcome cool in the evening, and well into nightfall, as the flood of mourners thinned to a stream and finally a trickle that petered out when the moons and stars took dominion in the sky. "Sylvanas," The voice was gruff and sounded annoyed. Sylvanas, however, knew the speaker well enough to recognize concern in his tone. Nathanos stepped beside her, looking uncomfortable. He carried a cloth-covered plate. "What is it?" Sylvanas asked, eyeing the dish. "It's a troll's head," he said, irritated. "What do you think it is? Food. I wager you've not eaten a bite since yesterday. I don't think you want to fall flat on your face in front of the world tomorrow when you're formally named Ranger General." If anything could have made her smile, his words would have. He was right. She had been standing all day and not touched a bit of food or even drunk water. She hesitated. It felt disrespectful somehow when her parents could never again enjoy such simple things. Nathanos looked at her searchingly then, as always. He understood. Gently he placed a hand on her back and steered Sylvanas away from the beer. Now, away from the image of cloth-clad bodies being bathed in moon's light, he accepted the plate, opening her mouth to say she was thirsty. But Nathanos was already holding a water skin. Sylvanas nodded her head in thanks and drank. The water was cold and clean, as if he had scooped it from the river El Randar, reminding Sylvanas that, despite all evidence to the contrary, she was alive and could stave off physical needs no longer. "Let me take you home," Nathanos offered. Sylvanas shook her head. The thought of returning to Windrunner Spire was unbearable, knowing that she would never hear her father's warm laughter or even her mother's barbed scolding, that there would no longer be dancing in their favorite hollow while Lirath played and sang, that her parents would now whirl together in each other's arms, eyes locked, faces soft with love, only as ghosts, if indeed spirits they had become. She wondered if they had died quickly, how many enemies Lireesa had taken with her, if her father suffered, which of them had watched the other die first. Suddenly Sylvanas did not want to eat or drink, or do anything except stand beside her fallen family until her body collapsed from sheer exhaustion. And yet she did not want that either. She did not want to sleep because when she woke her eyes would flutter open on another new day of a world without her parents in it. She wanted to do nothing to enable that cruel dawn to approach more quickly. "You need food and rest," Nathanos said. "I'm fine." "You're too smart to say that," he said. "I have to pin you down and force feed you, because I will." When Nathanos didn't even get a hint of a smile or a challenge from her, his face furrowed into deep grooves. "No one else is coming now. It's just us," he said more quietly. "Sit. Eat." Sylvanas did so, feeling a start of pain as limbs and joints, locked so long into position, were allowed to move again. Awkward and heavy with grief, she let Nathanos ease her down and accepted the bread, cheese, and water he offered. The bread was dry and tasteless, and she almost couldn't swallow the cheese, but she forced herself to do so. At one point, Sylvanas sagged, so depleted, so alone, even though she still had family, the Farstriders, the trio, and Nathanos. She leaned her head against Nathanos' shoulder. "Just for a moment, I will close my eyes." The last several days had been the most devastating of her life. Tomorrow promised to be a little easier, and the days after that, they would unfold as they would, but they would not get the better of her. Despite herself, sleep finally won the battle. Blessedly, she had no dreams. So that was the beginning of the tragedy of Sylvanas. But while it will shape their family and it will begin to snowball with her, many, if not most people, undergo some tragedy. But losing both parents at once, at a relatively young age, would be hard. Especially that family. I mean, it's a little picturesque. But there's more to come. So we got to this episode in the pipe 5x5, and we will continue to see Sylvanas' rise of stature and prowess coinciding with an equally precipitous descent into tragic circumstances in the next episodes of Lore of Warcraft.